I watched the line thin while the orders remained unchanged. Maps said, hold, but the ground said we were already being measured for loss. Each adjustment I approved kept the division intact and placed my name closer to blame. By dawn, the line still existed, and I understood what it had cost to keep it. In October 1941, the German advance toward Moscow entered a critical phase. Operation Typhoon, launched at the end of September, had broken through several layers of Soviet defense west of the capital. Large encirclements near Vyazma and Bryansk had destroyed or scattered multiple Red Army formations. Roads leading east were crowded with retreating units, refugees, and supply columns moving in both directions. The weather, still dry, favored rapid movement. German armored spearheads were already approaching the Mozhaisk Defense Line, the last prepared belt of field fortifications before Moscow itself. The Mozhaisk Line was not a single continuous trench system, but a series of partially completed defensive positions anchored on towns, rivers, and road junctions. Construction had begun only weeks earlier, relying on civilian labor, militia units, and engineering detachments working under air attack and constant pressure. Many positions lacked depth. Ammunition dumps were incomplete. Communications were unreliable. Yet the line represented the final organized barrier, intended to slow the German approach long enough for reserves to be assembled closer to the capital. On 10th October, elements of the Soviet Western Front were ordered to occupy these positions and hold as long as possible. Among the formations assigned was a rifle division that had recently been reconstituted after losses earlier in the summer. Its personnel included a mix of veterans, newly mobilized conscripts, and officers promoted rapidly to fill gaps. The division sector lay astride a secondary road west of Mozhaisk, a route not suitable for heavy armor in poor weather but still usable under current conditions. Within the division headquarters, located in a forested area several kilometers behind the forward positions, routine work continued despite the situation. Reports were compiled, strength returns updated, and liaison officers dispatched to neighboring units. Maps were spread across rough tables, marked with pencil lines that changed daily. The staff understood that the front was unstable, but orders emphasized delay rather than counterattack. Time, not terrain, was the resource being expended. One of the officers assigned to this headquarters was a major serving as the division's operations officer. His responsibilities were not exceptional for his rank. Coordinating unit dispositions, relaying orders from higher command, and preparing situation summaries. He had been an officer before the war, trained in pre-war doctrine that emphasized maneuver, coordinated fire, and centralized control. Like many in his position, his experience since June had been shaped more by improvisation than by formal planning. His daily routine involved visiting regimental command posts, checking communications lines, and reconciling conflicting reports. Units reported strengths that varied depending on the source. Rifle companies nominally listed at full strength often fielded half their men. Heavy weapons were in short supply. Anti-tank rifles were distributed unevenly, and artillery support depended on ammunition deliveries that were frequently delayed. On the morning of 11th October, the operations officer reviewed the division's overnight reports. Patrols had made contact with German reconnaissance elements probing the forward line. No major attack had yet developed in the division's sector, but neighboring formations reported pressure on their flanks. The sound of distant artillery was constant, sometimes closer than expected. The air situation favored the Germans, though low clouds limited sustained air operations. The operational problem facing the division was already apparent. Its assigned frontage was wider than doctrine recommended. Reserves were minimal. The division's attached artillery regiment had fewer guns than authorized and limited ammunition. Communications with higher headquarters were intermittent. Orders from the Army Command emphasized holding the line, but provided little guidance on withdrawal criteria or fallback positions beyond general references to delaying actions. During a midday briefing, regimental commanders reported on the condition of their positions. Earthworks were shallow in some areas due to frozen ground. Wire obstacles were incomplete. Mines had been laid where available, but quantities were insufficient to cover all approaches. Morale varied. Some units, particularly those with experienced cadres, showed discipline and cohesion. Others were visibly strained by fatigue and uncertainty. The operations officer noted these details carefully, recording them in the situation log. His role required him to present a coherent picture upward, even when the underlying reality was fragmented. He was aware that higher headquarters depended on these reports to make decisions affecting multiple formations. At the same time, he understood that overly pessimistic assessments could be interpreted as lack of resolve. By late afternoon, German pressure increased. Forward observers reported motorized infantry moving into assembly areas west of the division's sector. Artillery fire intensified, focusing on road junctions and suspected command posts. The division's communications section reported damage to telephone lines. Radio traffic increased as units attempted to re-establish contact. The operations officer was dispatched to a regimental headquarters closer to the front to assess the situation directly. The journey took longer than expected due to traffic and shelling along the road. When he arrived, he found the regimental commander engaged in organizing local reserves to reinforce a threatened sector. Maps showed German units approaching from two directions, suggesting a possible attempt to bypass the main defensive positions rather than assault them directly. The regimental commander requested permission to pull back one battalion to a secondary line to avoid encirclement. According to standing orders, withdrawal required authorization from higher command. The operations officer noted the request, but could not approve it himself. He advised the commander to prepare fallback positions discreetly while maintaining current dispositions. Returning to division headquarters in the early evening, the operations officer compiled his observations. He noted the growing gap on the right flank, the limited ability to counter armored thrusts, and the risk posed by continued German reconnaissance. He also recorded the efforts being made to improve defenses and maintain control. As darkness fell, reports arrived from the neighboring division indicating a breakthrough on their front. German units had forced a crossing of a small river, pushing Soviet elements back several kilometers. This development increased the threat to the division's flank and rear. The Army headquarters was informed, but its response was delayed. At a late evening staff meeting, the division commander reviewed the situation with his senior officers. The commander was under clear instructions to hold the Mozhaisk line for as long as possible. Withdrawal without orders was discouraged. At the same time, the loss of cohesion could lead to encirclement and destruction, as had happened earlier in the campaign. The operations officer presented his assessment in measured terms. He described the condition of the forward units, the enemy's movements, and the risks associated with both holding and withdrawing. He avoided dramatic language, focusing instead on concrete observations. The commander listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on distances and unit strengths. No immediate decision was made that night. Orders from higher command had not yet arrived. The division was instructed to maintain its positions, reinforce weak sectors where possible, and prepare for further developments. The staff returned to their duties, drafting orders and updating maps under dim light. In the early hours of 12th October, the sound of artillery fire increased again. Reports suggested that German forces were preparing a coordinated attack at first light. The operations officer reviewed the night's communications and noted delays in message transmission. He also observed that several units had already taken losses from shelling, further reducing their combat effectiveness. As dawn approached, the division remained in place, committed to a line that was increasingly difficult to hold. The operational problem was no longer abstract. It involved specific units, specific terrain, and a narrowing margin for error. The question of how long the division could continue under these conditions was becoming unavoidable, even if it had not yet been formally addressed. By the morning of 12th October 1941, the division's situation had deteriorated further. At first light, German artillery opened sustained fire across the forward positions, concentrating on known strongpoints and road approaches. The pattern suggested preparation for a deliberate attack rather than probing action. Within the first hour, several forward companies reported casualties and damage to field works that had taken days to construct. Communications failures compounded the problem. Telephone lines were repeatedly cut by shell fire. Radio sets functioned unevenly, affected by terrain and equipment shortages. Messages arrived late or incomplete, forcing the division staff to rely on runners for confirmation. This slowed the decision-making process and increased uncertainty at every level. The operations officer remained at division headquarters through the morning, coordinating reports as they arrived. Regimental commanders requested clarification on withdrawal conditions, particularly in sectors where German infantry had begun infiltrating through wooded areas. Standing orders remained unchanged: hold positions, delay the enemy, and prevent a breakthrough toward Mozhaisk. Shortly after midday, German motorized infantry supported by light armor engaged the division's right regiment. The attack did not take the form of a single-massed assault. Instead, it consisted of pressure applied at multiple points, exploiting gaps between companies and weakly held terrain. Soviet anti-tank weapons engaged when possible, but ammunition was limited, and not all positions had clear fields of fire. Reports from the front indicated that one battalion had lost contact with its neighboring unit. Attempts to re-establish coordination failed. The regimental commander reported that his reserve company was already committed and that further resistance depended on artillery support that might not be available for long. The attached artillery regiment reported that its ammunition expenditure was exceeding resupply rates. The division commander convened another staff discussion in the early afternoon. The operations officer presented updated maps showing enemy advances measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, but the cumulative effect was significant. German units were gaining access to the rear approaches of several forward positions. The risk of piecemeal encirclement was increasing. Higher headquarters remained largely silent. When communication was established, the Army Command reiterated the importance of holding the Mozhaisk Line. The directive emphasized that time gained here would allow the formation of new defensive groupings closer to Moscow. No explicit guidance was given on acceptable losses or withdrawal thresholds. As the afternoon wore on, casualties mounted. Medical sections reported difficulty evacuating wounded due to shelling and congestion on supply routes. Some wounded were treated in place, further straining unit resources. The psychological impact of sustained bombardment became apparent. Officers reported signs of exhaustion and confusion among less experienced troops. The operations officer was sent forward again, this time to the division's left regiment, which had so far avoided major engagement. The journey revealed the broader situation. Refugees and rear echelon personnel moved eastward along the same roads used by supply columns. Vehicles were abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. The sense of order that had characterized earlier stages of the defense was eroding. At the regimental headquarters, the commander described a growing concern about the adjacent unit's collapse. Enemy movement on the flank suggested that the regiment might soon face pressure from an unexpected direction. The commander requested authority to shorten his line and withdraw to more defensible ground along a small river to the rear. The operations officer recorded the request and advised caution. Without orders, such a move risked disciplinary consequences, yet holding the current line might result in isolation. The tension between regulation and reality was no longer theoretical. It was present in every decision made at the regimental level. Returning to division headquarters near dusk, the operations officer compiled another report. He included specific details: ammunition remaining by battery, estimated infantry strength by battalion, and the status of communications. He avoided language that could be interpreted as defeatist, but the factual content left little room for optimism. As darkness fell, German activity did not subside. Reconnaissance patrols probed Soviet lines throughout the night. Occasional artillery fire disrupted rest and repair efforts. The division's engineers attempted to improve fallback positions, but resources were limited and time insufficient. Late that night, a message arrived from Army headquarters acknowledging the worsening situation. It authorized limited tactical withdrawals to avoid encirclement, but stressed that positions should be held as long as possible. The language was deliberately vague, placing responsibility for interpretation on divisional commanders. The division commander reviewed the message with his staff. The operations officer noted that the authorization did not specify distances or conditions, leaving significant discretion to those on the ground. The commander instructed regiments to hold through the night and reassess at first light. Preparations for withdrawal were to be made discreetly, without visible movement that might encourage panic. By the early hours of 13th October, reports indicated that one forward company had been forced to abandon its position after heavy losses. The gap was temporarily filled by a reserve platoon, but the line was thin. German units continued to apply pressure, testing for weak points. The operations officer reviewed casualty figures and noted a steady decline in effective strength. Units that had been considered capable of sustained defense 2 days earlier were now approaching exhaustion. Equipment losses further reduced combat effectiveness. The division's ability to execute a coordinated withdrawal, if ordered, was becoming questionable. At dawn, the situation clarified but did not improve. German infantry renewed attacks along the division's right and center. Artillery fire intensified. Reports from neighboring divisions suggested further withdrawals, increasing the risk of exposure on the flanks. The division commander faced a narrowing set of options. Holding the line promised continued attrition with diminishing returns. Withdrawing risked disorganization and potential punishment, if judged premature. The operations officer, observing these developments, recognized that the gap between doctrine and reality was widening. Official instructions assumed a level of control and endurance that no longer existed on the ground. As the morning progressed, the division remained engaged, its fate tied to decisions that would soon need to be made. The operational problem had escalated from a matter of delay to a question of survival, and the weight of that distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. By the afternoon of 13th October 1941, the division's situation had crossed from severe into critical. German forces had identified weak points along the sector and were pressing them methodically. Their tactics emphasized steady forward movement supported by artillery rather than rapid armored thrusts. This approach reduced exposure while exploiting the Soviet division's limited reserves and fragile communications. The division commander spent much of the day receiving fragmentary reports. Some units reported holding their ground, others described local withdrawals undertaken to avoid being outflanked. These movements were rarely coordinated across regimental boundaries, increasing the risk of gaps forming along the line. The commander relied heavily on his operations officer to assemble a coherent picture from incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. The operations officer worked continuously, marking enemy positions and Soviet withdrawals on the map. He noted that several battalions were now operating below half strength. Ammunition shortages were becoming acute, particularly for artillery and mortars. Requests for resupply had been sent repeatedly, but transport limitations and enemy air activity prevented timely delivery. Shortly after midday, a report arrived from the Right Regiment indicating that German infantry had reached the regiment's rear supply route. The report did not suggest a complete breakthrough, but it confirmed that enemy units were maneuvering freely behind the forward positions. This development significantly increased the risk of encirclement. The regimental commander requested immediate authorization to withdraw his forward battalions to a secondary line. He emphasized that continued resistance in the current positions would likely result in the loss of those units. The operations officer recognized the seriousness of the request. He relayed it directly to the division commander, along with his own assessment that the division's right flank was no longer secure. The division commander reviewed the situation in silence. Official doctrine emphasized holding ground and delaying the enemy at all costs, particularly so close to Moscow. However, the doctrine also assumed that units retained the ability to maneuver and withdraw in good order. The evidence suggested that this assumption was becoming increasingly unrealistic. Higher headquarters had not issued new instructions. Communication attempts produced only general encouragement to resist and reminders of the strategic importance of the Mozhaisk Line. No explicit permission for a general withdrawal had been granted. The turning point came not with a dramatic event, but with a gradual accumulation of constraints. The operations officer noted that if the division remained in its current positions through another day of sustained attack, several battalions would likely be cut off. Once isolated, their chances of rejoining the division would be minimal. The loss of those units would reduce the division's combat effectiveness to a level insufficient for any further defensive role. During an afternoon conference, the operations officer presented this assessment to the division commander. He framed it in practical terms: current strength levels, estimated enemy movements, and the time required to disengage units under fire. He avoided language that could be interpreted as advocating disobedience, but the implication was clear. Delay beyond a certain point would remove the possibility of controlled withdrawal. The commander asked whether the division could hold for another day without catastrophic losses. The operations officer replied cautiously, stating that it might be possible in some sectors, but unlikely across the entire frontage. He emphasized that the Right Regiment was already close to being enveloped. After a brief pause, the commander issued a limited instruction. The Right Regiment was authorized to shorten its line and pull back its most exposed battalions during the night, while maintaining contact with neighboring units if possible. This was not a full withdrawal order. It was a local adjustment, justified as a tactical measure to preserve cohesion. The decision carried personal risk. If higher headquarters judged the move unnecessary or premature, responsibility would fall on the division commander and his staff. The operations officer was aware that his assessment had influenced the decision. His role did not grant him authority, but it did place moral weight on his recommendations. The order was transmitted using cautious language. Units were instructed to improve their positions to the rear and adjust their frontage. The word withdrawal was avoided. This reflected both doctrinal sensitivity and concern about morale. Orders emphasized discipline, silence, and coordination. As night fell, movement began on the right flank. Infantry units disengaged under cover of darkness, leaving small elements forward to mask the movement. Artillery provided limited fire to disrupt enemy observation. The process was uneven. Some units moved smoothly. Others encountered confusion, losing contact with neighboring elements. The operations officer monitored these developments from division headquarters, receiving reports throughout the night. He noted that German reaction was limited, suggesting that the movement had not been fully detected. This reduced immediate pressure, but the overall situation remained precarious. By the early hours of 14th October, the Right Regiment had established a shortened line closer to the rear. The division's frontage was reduced, improving internal coordination, but increasing reliance on neighboring units to cover exposed areas. The division had gained time, but at the cost of deviating from strict interpretations of orders. As dawn approached, the operations officer reviewed the updated map. The division was no longer holding its original assigned positions, yet it remained intact. The question now was whether this adjustment would be sufficient to stabilize the situation, or whether further decisions of similar nature would soon be required. The morning of 14th October 1941 revealed the consequences of the previous night's decision. The division's right flank, now pulled back to a shorter line, showed improved internal cohesion. Units that had been close to isolation were again in contact with their regimental headquarters. Ammunition stocks, though still limited, could be redistributed more effectively. Communications, while fragile, were more manageable over the reduced frontage. German forces responded cautiously. Reconnaissance patrols advanced to test the new positions, and artillery fire adjusted to account for the altered line. There was no immediate large-scale assault. Instead, pressure continued in a measured fashion, suggesting that German commanders were assessing the change and preparing their next move. At division headquarters, the operations officer compiled the morning situation report. He noted the improved alignment of units and the avoidance of encirclement on the right. He also recorded the cost of the maneuver, stragglers, abandoned equipment, and confusion among some rear elements. These were not unusual under the circumstances, but they carried implications for discipline and accountability. Shortly after the report was transmitted, a response arrived from Army headquarters. It requested clarification on the division's current dispositions and the reasons for the apparent shift in positions. The message was neutral in tone, but direct. It reflected awareness that the division was no longer holding its originally assigned line. The division commander reviewed the message with his staff. He instructed the operations officer to prepare a detailed explanation, emphasizing tactical necessity and the intent to preserve combat capability. The report avoided references to disobedience or withdrawal. Instead, it framed the action as a realignment to maintain continuous defense under enemy pressure. As the day progressed, German artillery increased its focus on the center of the division's line. Several positions were subjected to sustained fire, resulting in further casualties and damage to field works. Requests for additional artillery support were made, but the division's own guns were already stretched thin, and higher-level support was uncertain. The operations officer was again sent forward, this time to assess the center regiment's ability to withstand continued pressure. He found the regiment holding, but only with difficulty. Company commanders reported that their men were exhausted and that ammunition for automatic weapons was nearly depleted. The regiment's commander expressed concern that without relief or resupply, his units would not be able to repel a determined assault. Returning to division headquarters in the late afternoon, the operations officer presented his findings. The division commander listened and then turned his attention to the broader picture. Reports from neighboring divisions indicated continued withdrawals and heavy fighting. The Mozhaisk Line, intended as a temporary barrier, was being eroded unevenly along its length. Another message from Army headquarters arrived that evening. This one carried a more critical tone. It reiterated the importance of holding assigned positions and warned against unauthorized movement that could compromise the defense of Moscow. While it did not explicitly accuse the division of misconduct, the implication was clear. The division commander faced renewed pressure from above. The operations officer recognized that the earlier decision, while tactically justified, had placed the command under scrutiny. Any further adjustments would be examined closely and might not be tolerated. As darkness fell, German infantry renewed probing attacks along the center and left. These actions were limited in scale but persistent. Soviet units responded with rifle and machine gun fire, repelling several attempts to approach the trenches. Losses continued on both sides, though exact figures were difficult to establish. The division's medical services reported growing difficulty coping with the wounded. Evacuation routes were under fire, and transport was scarce. Some wounded remained in forward positions longer than advisable. The operations officer noted these conditions in his log, aware that such details rarely influenced immediate operational decisions, but mattered for accountability. Late that night, the division commander convened a small group of senior officers. The discussion was restrained and focused on practical matters. The commander acknowledged the pressure from higher headquarters and the limits of the division's endurance. He emphasized the need to maintain order and discipline regardless of future decisions. The operations officer understood that the margin for discretion was narrowing. The earlier adjustment had preserved the division for the moment, but it had also drawn attention. Any further deviation from orders would carry greater personal and professional risk for those involved. As the night wore on, the division held its shortened line. German activity remained steady but not overwhelming. The front was temporarily stable, though fragile. The decisions made over the next day would determine whether the division could continue to function as a coherent force, or whether its remaining strength would be consumed by continued attrition. On 15 October 1941, the division received formal orders that clarified what had already become apparent on the ground. Army headquarters authorized a phased withdrawal to positions east of the Mozhaisk Line, coordinated with neighboring formations. The language emphasized order, discipline, and the preservation of combat capability. It did not reference earlier deviations or assign blame. The directive reflected a broader reassessment of the situation west of Moscow. For the division commander and his staff, the order brought relief without vindication. The withdrawal was to be conducted under pressure, with German forces close and actively probing. There was little room for error. Units were to disengage sequentially, maintaining rear guards to delay pursuit. Artillery support was to be rationed carefully, covering key routes and choke points. The operations officer oversaw the planning of the movement. He coordinated timetables, assigned responsibilities, and worked to ensure that units understood their roles. The process was constrained by fatigue, equipment shortages, and limited transport. Nonetheless, the division retained enough structure to carry out the task. The withdrawal unfolded unevenly over the next 2 days. Some units disengaged successfully, moving east under cover of darkness. Others encountered German patrols and were forced to fight their way through. Losses continued, but they were less catastrophic than earlier encirclements suffered elsewhere. The division remained intact, though reduced in strength. By the time the division reached its new positions closer to Moscow, it no longer resembled the formation that had occupied the Mozhaisk Line. Infantry battalions were under strength. Heavy weapons were scarce. Many officers were exhausted. Yet the division still existed as a functioning unit, capable of contributing to further defensive efforts. In the days that followed, higher headquarters conducted reviews of recent operations. Reports were collected, maps compared, and timelines reconstructed. The division's earlier adjustment on the right flank was noted, but it was not singled out for punitive action. The focus shifted to stabilizing the front and integrating newly arrived reserves. The operations officer continued his duties without comment or recognition. His assessments and recommendations were absorbed into official reports, stripped of personal attribution. Like many decisions made during that period, the choice to preserve cohesion over strict adherence to initial orders became part of the larger, anonymized record of the defense. In later years, official histories would describe the fighting along the Mozhaisk Line in broad terms. They would note the delays imposed on the German advance and the time gained for the defense of Moscow. Individual decisions at the divisional and regimental level received little attention. The moral weight carried by officers who balanced orders against the survival of their men was rarely examined directly. The division itself would go on to fight again, rebuilt and reinforced, its earlier losses partially replaced. The operations officer would remain in service, his wartime record marked by routine evaluations and formal commendations, typical of his rank. The decision to hold for one more day, and then to adjust under pressure, would not be recorded as a distinct moment. It would exist only in the accumulated outcomes of actions taken quietly, without ceremony. Such decisions were common during the autumn of 1941. They did not change the course of the war on their own. They did, however, determine whether units survived to fight again, and whether officers carried the burden of having chosen between doctrine and responsibility. If you value careful examinations of these quieter decisions and the individuals who made them under constraint, this channel exists to preserve and explore those stories.